Welcome to the dark world of scary stories. A place where every sound is a premonition of the unknown, and every shadow is a step into another dimension. If you're ready to open the door to the scariest secrets, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the bell, because the scariest is yet to come. Turn on the light and let's beg. The Hanging Gardens of Semiramis, a dark legacy, a dark evening enveloped Babylon, and its mighty walls seemed even more ominous in the moonlight. The ancient city, once a center of grandeur, was now but a shadow of its former glory. Babylon was a city where power, beauty, and horrors blended together. And amid these horrors were legends that even the oldest elders dared not speak of. The legend of the Hanging Gardens of Semiramis was among them, one of the most terrifying and mysterious. From the very beginning, when these gardens were built, they not only amazed the imagination with their beauty but were shrouded in mysteries. According to one of the most widely accepted versions, this magnificent structure was created by Queen Semiramis as a symbol of her love for her husband, King Nabonidus. The gardens, which hung on thermal platforms, were covered with an incredible number of rare plants that could only grow under special climatic conditions. However, despite their outward beauty, these gardens concealed terrible secrets. The story began a few years after the gardens were constructed. Almost all of those who worked on their creation vanished without a trace or went mad. Various rumors spoke of dark forces awakening at the very heart of the gardens, of spirits wandering among the trees, and of a curse that befell anyone who dared to enter these places after sunset. People began to avoid the gardens, but rumors of their dark powers continued to spread more and more. One of those who wasn't afraid to enter this cursed place was a young archaeologist named Eric. He was obsessed with uncovering the secrets of Semiramis's gardens. Eric believed that behind the legends lay real events and that this majestic structure contained the key to understanding the darkest secrets of ancient Babylon. He assembled a team of several brave people, each with their own reason for venturing into these places, but none of them were prepared for what awaited them. On the first night in the garden, Eric and his team began to hear strange sounds, whispers echoing from shadowy corners and even the faint sound of footsteps that could not be explained. And though they were sure no one was following them, each of them felt that this grim forest seemed alive, and its eyes were watching them from all sides. The first night ended without incident, but the next day one of the group members, a young researcher named Timur, disappeared. Eric and his team had no idea where he went but were convinced that he had been taken by the forces inhabiting the garden. However, even after this, they did not abandon their search, as each of them was willing to face the most terrifying trials to uncover the truth. Over the next few days, the researchers came across a mysterious arch deep within the gardens, one that no one had seen before. It was a massive stone arch, covered in moss, and it seemed to lead to another world, one where light and shadow interacted in such a way that the space around them appeared to shift. As they passed through the arch, it became clear that it was not just a part of the gardens, but a portal to another dimension, where every step was dangerous, and every shadow hid death. Eric felt his heart beat faster. Was this not the very world they had been searching for? Was this the answer to all these mysteries? Well, for each of them, it was the last journey to these dreadful gardens, for here, in the darkness, they realized one terrifying truth. The Hanging Gardens of Semiramis were not just beautiful, they were cursed. They stood before the massive stone arch that led into an unknown dark space, where light and shadow battled for dominance, creating sinister distortions. Time seemed to stop, and although Eric felt a deep sense of unease, he couldn't look away from this portal. He knew that their path now had no turning back. Here they were, on the brink of a discovery that promised either unforgettable glory or eternal oblivion. "Are you all ready?" Eric asked, although he knew his question was mere formality. There was no way back now. The answer was silence. Each of them felt the weight of fear, as heavy as a stone on their hearts, but alongside it was the irresistible desire to uncover the truth. One more step into the darkness, and they would remain there forever. The first to pass through the arch was Eric, and he immediately felt the atmosphere change. The wind, which had previously been warm and dry, turned cool and unpleasantly damp. Shadows began to move around them, resembling air dresses made of black dust, dancing around and vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. Each of them seemed to hear whispers that wound around their ears, though no living creatures were nearby. "We're not alone," said one of the team members, Jared, gazing into the darkness ahead. His voice trembled with unease. "This isn't just a garden, it's a trap," added another, Adam, who had been more skeptical, but even he felt the fear creeping up on him with each new step. They ventured deeper into the dark labyrinth, and suddenly the ground beneath their feet became soft, like down. At first, they thought it was just forest undergrowth, but with every step, the softness became increasingly suspicious. Each of them felt their feet sink into an invisible trap, but fortunately, they did not fall in. This isn't just earth," whispered Jared, looking at his boots, which were being sucked into a dark, slippery substance. "It's alive," said Eric, almost dreamily, but at the same time with horror, as he realized the ground in the garden wasn't just soil. It was part of something much bigger, darker, and more terrifying than they could have imagined. They moved forward, and soon another structure appeared before them, a large stone building that looked more like a temple than part of the gardens. Its massive doors, covered in deep cracks, were adorned with ancient symbols that seemed to pulse with light. Legend spoke of ancient rituals performed in these gardens, but now it seemed not just a legend, it was a living reality awakening. Eric felt his heart tighten as he stepped onto the threshold of the temple. At that very moment, the doors opened on their own, as if inviting them inside. They entered, and inside, everything was covered in the dust of centuries. The dark and cold space had no living creature, except for themselves. They gazed at a massive stone table in the center of the temple. An ancient symbol was carved into it, one that seemed familiar to Eric, though he couldn't recall where from. Suddenly, the doors behind them slammed shut, and darkness engulfed every corner of the temple. "Someone else is here," whispered Alice, one of the team members, when she felt the cold breath of foreign eyes on her skin. Before they could turn around, uninvited creatures appeared at the center of the temple. Dead, semi-transparent figures with eyes burning like fire. They were part of the garden, part of something much older and more sinister. Each of these figures resembled a soul bound to this place for eternity. They could not escape because the garden held them there. And perhaps they were just the next victims, to become part of this dreadful cycle. "Running won't help," Eric said, turning to the team. "We are all already a part of this place. And the only way to survive is to find what made this horror exist." But this was only the beginning. The creatures from the darkness drew closer, and they realized, not everyone who enters these gardens leaves them alive. The darkness that surrounded them on all sides seemed alive. Shadows moved as if they were creatures, wandering in search of victims. Eric and his team stood, unsure if they would muster the strength to find an escape or if they had already become part of this nightmare. The beings that appeared before them were not quite human. Their faces were blurred, like ruined statues, and their bodies seemed semi-transparent, covered with ancient symbols and runes. Their eyes burned with a red flame that seemed to radiate not just fire, but pure darkness. Alice, the one who appeared the least brave among the group, took a step back and fell to the ground as one of the figures approached her. Her lips trembled with fear, and just one look at the creature caused her to lose consciousness for a moment. "What is this?" she managed to whisper, as her hands turned as cold as ice. Eric, pressing his hand to her shoulder, gritted his teeth. He knew that now was not the time for panic. They had to act, and act quickly. But what could they do? How could they face beings who were neither fully alive nor fully dead? "We can't retreat," he said, gathering the rest of the team. "We have to understand what they want. We need to find the source of their power, or we'll never escape this place." But while Eric was speaking, one of the apparitions began moving toward them, and the motion was not only threatening but utterly horrifying. It wasn't walking, it was floating, carried by some invisible force that seemed to hold it in the air. Its eyes turned even redder, and its skin stretched in all directions as it approached. There was no doubt, this was not just a spirit or a ghost. This was something older and darker. "Think," Eric shouted, turning to his companions. "Have you seen anything like this before?" But in their eyes, there was only terror. Jared, the scientist who had never believed in the mystical, now looked as if everything he had ever believed had turned to dust. I don't know what this is," he whispered, but his words were no longer convincing. "But this can't be normal." And at that moment, when everyone was ready to give up, when fear and terror had seeped into their hearts, Eric suddenly realized something. All these beings, these souls wandering in the dark, had to be tied to something specific. They weren't random, they were the result of something ancient, and most likely, their presence was merely a consequence of the curse that lay behind the gardens themselves. "This isn't just the curse of the gardens," he exclaimed. "This is the curse of this land. And it all started with rituals that were performed here for centuries. Everyone looked at him with interest, but he was already sure. The beings that had been pursuing them were not just the souls of the dead, they were part of the ritual that had turned the gardens into such a place. The same ritual that enabled the gardening and the growth of the wondrous plants also opened a portal between the worlds of the living and the dead, and this led to all those who had died in the garden never finding peace. They became obsessed with this place. "We need to find the stone," Eric said. "It's the foundation of everything. Only it can close this portal." They all agreed that the only chance was to find the stone. But where could they search for it in these endless corridors and ruins? And then a new trial began. From the darkness, another figure appeared. Larger, darker, and more powerful than the rest. It looked like a woman, but her eyes, glowing red, indicated that she was not a living being. She moved closer to them, and the entire temple shuddered at her arrival. Her voice echoed deeply, like thunder in the mountains, and it seemed that every word caused pain in their souls. "You will not leave this place," she said. "Your souls will remain here. You have become part of the gardens. Forever." And then the darkness enveloped them in deep silence. All attempts to escape her grasp were futile. But they knew, if they didn't find the stone and destroy the source of the power, they would remain here, forever forgotten by the world. The darkness in the temple was so thick that even the slightest movement left no trace. Their hearts beat faster with anxiety, and every sound seemed like a threat, growing ever closer. They all stood still, knowing that only one thing could save them: finding the stone that, according to ancient legends, held the power to close the portal between the world of the living and the dead. However, the shadow that appeared before them was more than just a figure. It was the very essence of these gardens. Its presence felt not only in the space around them but in every breath they took. This creature was terrifying not only because of its shape but because it was made of dark energies that ruled over the garden. "Do you wish to find the stone?" The creature's voice echoed, like the rustling of leaves, yet powerful enough that there was more force in its tone than in the voice of any living being. "Then why don't you see it?" The creature stretched its hand into the darkness, and before them appeared not just an image, but a reality. They saw that the stone was right before them, but it wasn't an ordinary object. It was a living stone, woven with the roots of the garden, connected to the dark forces that kept this space under their control. It was part of the garden itself, and it was its sacrifice, its purpose, to trap anyone who drew near. "The stone cannot simply be taken," Eric said, feeling the creature's gaze upon him. "It is tied to the power of the gardens. It's part of everything that keeps this nightmare alive." But could they truly destroy the source of this power? Was there any hope at all? "To close the portal, we must restore the balance," Eric said, trying to find some way out. "We must give something equal to what we receive from the gardens." Jared lifted his gaze. His hands were trembling, but he was excited. He had found something that might hold the answer. It was an ancient book he spotted on a stone table in the center of the temple. Its pages were covered in dust and roots, but within it lay ancient wisdom that might show them how to destroy this evil. As he opened the book, he noticed an ancient symbol, similar to the rune they had seen on the temple doors. This sign, like the stone, was the key to breaking the curse. But this time, it was especially grim. It pointed to the need to offer one's soul as a sacrifice to save others. "We must give our souls," Jared said, reading a passage from the book, his voice filled with despair and uncertainty. Alice cried, her tears running down her face because she knew what this meant for each of them. They couldn't just take the stone and escape. They had to give up something significant as a sacrifice. "What do we do?" Jared asked, looking around at his companions. Eric paused. He didn't like the idea, but it was the only thing that could help. They had no other choice. I'm ready," he said, his voice firm in the silence. "This may be our only chance to save us all." The creature standing before them smiled ominously, as if it knew this moment would come. It didn't feel pain, only pleasure from how the humans had walked into its trap. Its eyes burned brighter, and it stepped forward. "Do you understand?" it asked, its voice like the cracking of wood. "You will give everything. Your consciousness will be part of the gardens. Your soul will become part of me." At that moment, Eric felt the dark force trying to consume him. He knew this creature was on the verge of swallowing their souls, but perhaps this was their chance, to give up their souls to destroy evil once and for all. "Let's do this together," he said, looking at his companions. They placed their hands on the stone, and the entire darkness exploded into light. The garden began to change. Everything around them trembled. And in that instant, as the dark forces tried to devour them, they felt their souls merge with the stone and the garden. Their bodies left this world, and they became part of this ancient place. But the garden was changing. The creatures that had terrorized them began to dissipate, like shadows when the sun touches them. The stone shattered, and with it, the dark force that had held this world in its grasp vanished. They were not victors, but they had broken the chains of this cursed place. And the garden, once a symbol of eternal horror, was finally silent and empty. And though their bodies were no more, their souls remained in this place, serving as a lesson for those who dared to enter it in the future. Despite the fact that they had given up their souls, and the garden seemed to have calmed and become silent, the very earth still held the memory of their pain and sacrifices. The wind no longer carried the whispers of ominous creatures, but there was something invisible in the air, something that still clung to their remains. Immediately after the darkness retreated and the garden was left empty, it seemed that everything had finally come to an end. But even in the silence, one could feel something stirring beneath the ground. Deep within the garden, somewhere beyond human reach, not everything was as it seemed. The stone, though shattered, still retained a part of its power that could not be completely destroyed. Its fragments, buried in darkness, still had the ability to influence the surrounding world, and even the death of those who had once wandered here did not rid the garden of the force that had been there from the beginning. No one knew what had happened to the bodies of Eric, Alice, Jared, and the others. Only their memories remained in the dark depths of this place, where no living soul had stepped since. Years passed after the last of the group of researchers disappeared, and the mystery of the Hanging Gardens of Semiramis remained unsolved. But, as often happens with such places, it was not forgotten. The legend of the ancient curse that had consumed dozens of researchers spread among new adventurers and archaeologists who had heard of the mystical excavations. They began arriving in hopes of finding something more than just the remnants of the gardens. The local inhabitants, once ordinary people but now transformed into guardians of ancient lands, warned those who attempted to approach these territories. They had seen strange phenomena, heard footsteps echoing through the old ruins, and whispers that did not belong to human mouths. They spoke of how the Garden of Semiramis had not remained empty, that the souls of those who had tried to penetrate its dark depths still wandered there. But the new seekers, undeterred by the warnings, set off on expeditions again. They wished to find the stone, unravel the secrets of the gardens, or at least carry away the remains of the magnificent plants that had once grown there. All of them, like their predecessors, forgot that this place did not forgive its visitors. Each one who approached the gardens did so with their own personal purpose, unaware that the land of this place had long since belonged to something else. And so, on the very night when one of the last researchers, a young archaeologist named Theodore, decided to search for these mysterious ruins, he arrived at the very spot that had already become a legend. And just like all those before him, he was unable to sense what had been hidden from his eyes. On the doorstep of the temple, where this terrible story had begun, he lost consciousness when he saw in the fog rising from the earth a familiar dark face. The tracks led only to the threshold, where the doors opened and disappeared forever into the mist. Now Theodore too had become part of this legend. And perhaps someone else, seeking mysteries once again, will return here, only to be swallowed by the garden that never lets go. Time passed, and it seemed that the garden itself began to absorb not only souls but also a part of reality. Those who remained alive could feel the boundaries between the world of the living and the dead closing in. They heard the earth whisper deep inside, and it was not merely the wind. It was something alive, something that could not be comprehended, even by the boldest of minds. The garden, this place of power, was alive, and it was changing those who approached it. However, the mystery of the Hanging Gardens of Semiramis did not disappear. It remained like an invisible, taut rope between times and realities. And although most archaeologists who tried to uncover the secrets of the gardens disappeared or were left with twisted minds, new seekers always arrived, ready to risk everything for the fame or discovery that could change the world. With each new arrival to the land of the Hanging Gardens, the idea grew stronger that this place was somehow connected to the echo of a great tragedy. Some believed that the curse of the gardens was tied to a secret ritual performed by the inhabitants of ancient Babylon. It was said that through this ritual place, a dark force emerged that gave the garden its eternal life, yet at the same time, it prevented anyone from leaving alive. However, No one could fully understand why the gardens remained untouched and terrifying after so much time had passed. Their influence extended beyond just the land or landscape. The garden had its own, almost magical nature. And the more people tried to understand, the deeper they were drawn into its vortex. One day, during another expedition, a group of archaeologists and researchers found themselves once again at these ancient ruins. They were fully aware of the danger they would face, but they had no choice. All of them were certain that they would be the ones to uncover the final secrets of the gardens and perhaps break this cursed cycle. But when they ventured deeper into the temple, they saw nothing but darkness. Everything changed when one of the scientists, a young researcher named Clara, stumbled upon an ancient door that appeared motionless and wouldn't open. Her heart stopped when she realized that the same runes, which had been seen by previous researchers, were engraved on the door. Clara, overcoming her fear, tried to open the door. And then something happened that they hadn't expected. The door trembled, and from the darkness, not just light emerged. It was the very soul of the garden. The garden, it seemed, was not merely standing at this place. It was connected to everyone who had tried to reveal its secrets. And now, with new seekers, this horror was revived. The shadows that filled the room began to move again. They became more tangible, more aggressive, as if the very spirits of the garden had risen from the depths of the earth, striving to devour anyone who had disturbed their peace. In that moment, Clara realized the terrifying truth. The garden never wanted to be abandoned. It didn't want its secret to be revealed, and everyone who set foot on its land had to become part of its immortal shadow. Those who have not lost themselves remain part of the garden, Clara whispered, understanding that they had likely already become part of this dreadful cycle. With a terrifying screech, the temple doors opened, and the shadows consumed them. None of the new researchers returned. And, as always, the Garden of Semiramis continued its existence. Its horrors quietly swirled, waiting for the next ones to dare to seek answers within it. Now, with each new generation, the garden became even more powerful, choosing its victims, who, leaving this world, became part of its eternal shadow. And none of them could ever escape the trap that the gardeners themselves had set for themselves centuries ago. Thus, the garden continued to exist, in the shadow, in the darkness, devouring and transforming those who got too close to its powerful forces. And one thing remained unshakable. There was no escaping the Garden of Semiramis. The next morning, after Clara and her team disappeared, strange and eerie events began to unfold in the village located near the ruins. People started complaining about terrible nightmares where they saw the lost researchers standing in the darkness among withered trees and black flowers. Tearful, exhausted, but with eyes that seemed not to belong to the living. With each passing day, fear and anxiety intensified. The locals felt that something invisible, yet very powerful, had awakened. And what they had tried to ignore became undeniable. It seemed that the garden had managed to expand its boundaries, stretching beyond its dead land. A place that was once isolated now began to push its black, cursed roots into the light. Soon new signs began to appear. Broken trees, traces of fire left behind after night storms, and small but increasingly frequent rituals that repeated among the people. Locals who dared to approach the ruins, or even just tried to be nearby, disappeared without a trace. Only their belongings remained: clothes, remnants of food, shoes with intact seams, but the people themselves never returned. One day, when the dark sky covered the village, the worst happened. All the roads leading to the gardens were blocked by fog that engulfed all living things. The villagers heard a piercing bell ringing from deep within the gardens. Not the usual church bells, but distorted and relentless, as if the garden itself decided to announce its dominion. At that moment, the terrible truth became clear. Those who sought the garden could not find answers. They sought the stone, they sought the riddle, but nothing was found. Only the immortal shadows of the garden, which grew stronger with each passing year, and they were no longer just part of that place. They became part of everyone who dared to approach. Legend said that the garden was not just an ominous place, but an enemy of humanity, which sought answers in the darkness. It felt as though time had stopped, and the night was endless, with darkness consuming not only the light but everything around it. Those who tried to leave the village could not find the way. The land itself seemed to twist and entangle them, leading them back to the same spot over and over again. The trees, once part of the living nature, now stood like skulls, reaching their cruel hands to the sky. And then something happened that even the bravest of minds could not have imagined. The villagers, not understanding how, but feeling an irresistible pull, began walking toward the garden. Step by step, like cursed beings, they approached the gates that had once been sealed shut. There was no trace of joy left, only the incomprehensible terror emanating from themselves. At the last moment, when all thoughts had receded, and the garden once again opened its black gates, the earth began to tremble violently. All those who crossed the threshold of this place became silent, their eyes filled with darkness, and their bodies became part of the garden, immortalized in the trees, in the flowers, in the dark dust that never retreated. And at the moment when the last soul left this world, the garden filled not only the land but also the air. It began to spread, overflowing reality, destroying the boundaries of time and space. What had once been only a terrifying legend had now become the force that kept these lands in eternal darkness. All who dared approach the Hanging Gardens of Semiramis became part of its infinite power. None returned, for they were no longer human. They had become parts of the garden itself, immersed in its darkness. The garden lived, and it would continue to live, until someone who dared to find it became its final victim. And so it would always be, until the time when the world itself succumbed to this eternal nightmare. Thus ended the story of the Hanging Gardens of Semiramis, which continued to wait for its next victim. They would never be forgotten. And so, as darkness once again envelopes you, we say goodbye, but not for long. Remember, the night is never truly safe. Subscribe so you don't miss the new horrors, and come back when it's time for new nightmares. Beware of the shadows. They are always near. Until next time.